the bills, and very quickly you realize there are more bills than there is money to pay those bills. Some of you have been there. Maybe many of us have been there at one point or another. Or maybe you go to the doctor and the doctor comes in and he says, you know those tests we've been running? Here's what they mean. And you hear something that you don't really want to hear as a result of those. What does it mean to walk by faith in our world? We tend to think of faith as big and gigantic things, but it really is walking in the small moments for most of us of life. And we began last week thinking about faith, and we defined it as believing what God says and building my life on it. So when you face those situations, how do you respond? Or when God calls you to do something and you don't see the resources to do it with. Maybe He's called you to go off to college, to a Christian school, to prepare for some kind of life, maybe ministry, maybe just working in the world and ministering, and you look at it and you say, I don't know how I'm going to do that. Or maybe He's called you into missions, and you look at the daunting task of raising that support. Or maybe some of you who've been at TLC this week, some of you young people, you made a decision for God, something you were going to do for God, and now you're home and that decision looks a whole lot bigger than it did at TLC. Or maybe as parents, it's God calling you to release your children into some kind of ministry or release them to move to another part of the country. Those are all parts of that walk of faith. And sometimes as I look at the things in my life, maybe as you look at the things in your life, we wonder how we can do it. Maybe it's simply living out the vows of your marriage in what is a difficult or trying circumstance. I think of Roger Munson in these last months that he's had with Lois and the dedication that he has demonstrated to his vows as a husband. That was not easy. That's part of a walk of faith. Maybe it's just being a witness in your neighborhood or in your school or at work, and you think, that's beyond me. Maybe all of those scenarios and ones I haven't even described cause you to think of your life kind of in these terms. Mission impossible. Does it feel that way sometimes? Does it feel like what God has called you to do is bigger than what you can do? We talked about last week from Hebrews 11, faith answers some key questions that are foundational to our lives, like how did we get here? There's a creator who put us here, to whom we're accountable. Why are we here? Ultimately, we are here to gain the commendation of God, to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, at the end of life. And what's ahead? What's ahead is eternity. Okay, but what does that look like in day-to-day life? It turns out that there are a lot of examples of that in the Old Testament. And the author of Hebrews in chapter 11 leads us through several of those examples. He starts off with Abraham. Both in secular Jewish literature and in the New Testament, Abraham is continually held up as an example of faith, as an example of a man who believed God and walked with God. And this morning we're going to look in Hebrews 11 at verses 8 through 12 at part of Abraham's life. And we're going to stick pretty closely to Hebrews for doing it because, the Lord willing, we're going to resume our study in Genesis next year, and we will jump right back into Genesis with the life of Abraham. So we're not going to spend much time or any time this morning in Genesis. We're going to look at and focus in on, out of all of Abraham's life, what does God draw our attention to here in Hebrews chapter 11? I'd suggest to you in the verses we're going to see this morning that he really tells us two characteristics of faith. whatever our name is, whatever our circumstances are, whatever it is God has called us to do, these two characteristics need to mark our lives as they marked Abraham's life. Faith is following God even when we don't see where we are going. Even when we don't see the destination, the end point. Living by faith simply means when God calls us, we follow Him off into the unknown. You could put it very simply this way: faith obeys when called. That summarizes much of what we're going to see about Abraham. That he, because he wanted the commendation of God, remember that's where we started last week, because he wants to hear well done from God, he obeys when God calls him. Verse 8 of chapter 11 says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. The grammar indicates that when he was called, there was an immediate and specific obedience. Now, we know from Genesis that it took a little bit of time and a stop along the way, but the author of Hebrews is saying this is what characterized Abraham. When he was called, he went. And remember that at this point in Abraham's life, he's about 75 years old. Now, they lived longer, but that's still a pretty good age to be uprooting yourself. He is married. He is established in his community. And his community, Ur of the Chaldees, is the most advanced city, the most advanced culture in the world of that day. And God says, Abraham, I want you to leave. Abraham says, okay, where am I going? Not going to tell you. You just go to the land that I will show you when you arrive there. And even though he is comfortable and established and respected where he lives, when God says move, he moves. He goes. What an example. I think of some within our own congregation and our missions family. I think of Bill and Melanie Benefield, who retired, comfortable, trailer, able to travel the country, and yet they uproot and they move to Togo to take care of the guest house there. And they do that by faith. Now, yes, they have grandchildren there, and that's a pull, but it still is a major move and challenge, and yet they accept it by faith. Or Louise Barnard, one of our missionaries who's in retirement, and yet almost every year or twice a year she leaves the comfort of Grand Rapids and goes to Bangkok, Thailand, and lives in that congested, crowded, chaotic city and works with the students in the Asia Baptist Theological Seminary. See, it doesn't matter our age, we still don't get to just sit back and forget following God. And Abraham, even at 75, follows God. The key is he was called. There was an objective truth, an objective word from God. It's not that one day Abraham saw a cloud in the sky shaped like a camel and thought, I think I'll get on my camel and travel. Or he saw handwriting in the sky that said Canaan. No, he knew. God spoke and said, Abraham, this is what I want you to do. And by faith, he did it. But even when he arrived in that land, he didn't receive the land. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise. It's called the land of promise. It was not the land of possession for Abraham. He never possessed it. All he ever owned of that land was a cave in which he buried his wife and other family members and the land around that cave. That's all he ever owned. He lived as in a foreign land. The word there literally means he lived alongside the people, but he wasn't part of them. He wasn't a permanent resident in that culture. He was a pilgrim. And he lived in tents. And the word there is the idea of settling down, but then you get in tents. People don't settle down typically in tents except the Bedouin. And so he's living and he's permanently located in the land, but he's not really owning the land, and he isn't permanently settled in the land, though he's living there permanently. How's that? And he did that with Isaac and Jacob, who are also heirs of the promise. So this was not a one-time decision to follow God by faith. This was a life. It was a daily decision to say, I believe God's given me this land. Though I don't own any of it, I'm going to live here and trust God. And God was working out his plan, but he was doing it from a human standpoint very, very slowly. Philip Brooks was a pastor in the 1800s in America. We would know him best for his Christmas carol that he wrote, O Little Town of Bethlehem. But Brooks was known as a man of godly character and known, at least on the outside by people around him, as a man of patience. That's why one day one of his members of his congregation was amazed to see Brooks just pacing the floor back and forth. And he said, Pastor Brooks, what is the matter? And I think of this story a lot because this is me, all right? He said, the problem is I'm in a hurry and God isn't. You been there? I'm in a hurry, but God's not. God's right on time. And Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived in that land. And we're going to see over in a couple of weeks that they lived there and they still didn't get the land. But faith obeys when it's called, even when it doesn't see where we're going. You know why? Because faith sees beyond the unknown to God. Faith says, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know God. And to illustrate that this morning, I've asked somebody to help me. So Jonathan, would you come up here, please? Jonathan Edwards is coming up to help me. There he is. And I've asked Jonathan to step out by faith this morning and to trust me, all right? So Jonathan, I want you to stand and face the congregation and close your eyes. Now, did you notice that there was a chair on the platform behind you? Okay. You saw where it was? Yes. All right, I'm about to move it. Okay. Now, here's what I'd like you to do, Jonathan. I want you to take my arm, and I'm going to lead you, and you're not going to know where you're going. Okay. Do you trust me? Yes. Okay. All right, so let's take a little walk across the platform and around. And we're walking. I'm walking by sight. He's walking by faith. And he trusts me, I think. All right, now, Jonathan, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn you around. I want you to take a step back. Step back. Okay. Now, do you trust me? Yes. Okay, sit down. Ah, thank you. It's there. You may go back to your seat. Thank you for helping me out on that. Now, how did he know the chair was there? Only because I told him. And he sat down by faith. Because if I had been mean and the chair hadn't been there, he'd have sat down in front of all of you and felt like a fool. But see, I assured him before the service that if I did that, that would ruin the whole illustration. So he really could trust me. Even if I am not as trustworthy as our God is, he could trust me in this. But Abraham had no idea where the land was, and yet he believed because he knew God. He trusted God. And ultimately, Hebrews tells us he wasn't just looking for land. He was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Now, you would say he was looking for heaven, and I would agree with you. That's what he's looking for. Well, how in the world did he know it existed? Well, maybe because Enoch walked with God and he was not, because God took him. And so Abraham had heard those stories, and he knew there was something else beyond this life. But he's looking for a city that has foundations, that has permanence. Had Abraham just been looking for a good city, he'd have stayed in Ur of the Chaldees. It was the best city in the world. But he was looking for something that was eternal, that was designed by and built by God. God's the architect. He's the general contractor. Can I suggest to you that underneath all of that, what Abraham is really seeking is God? He wants to live with God. He wants to be in God's home. He wants God's commendation. And so he goes out not knowing where he's going because he knows the ultimate destination isn't a physical land, it's God and his relationship with him. And he goes out not knowing where he's going because he trusts God, even though the future's unknown. And some of you are facing an unknown future. Some of you are facing challenges and you don't see the answers. Can I suggest to you the very best thing you can do in the midst of all of that is not just to look for answers. You can look for answers. But the very best thing you can do is to ground yourselves in God. Get to know God. Spend time with God. Read God's Word. Talk to God in prayer. And allow your focus to be God more than it is what's unknown out ahead of you. So that you walk with Him. And if you walk with Him, then He will take care of the rest. Someone has said the important thing is not what we live in, but what we live for. Abraham wasn't worried about the city and the land in which he would live. He was living for God. Faith is following even when we don't see where, because we know God. And this morning here in this worship center or in connections or watching online, you may not know God personally. You may not have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And you've been saying, but I have all of these questions. I want to know the answer to this question and that question. And if there's a God, why is there evil? And why do people suffer? And how did we get here? And there's nothing wrong with looking for answers. But I want to tell you, if you don't know Christ as Savior, you will never get all the answers. You'll never be able to answer all of those questions. Because if you could, your faith wouldn't be in God. Your faith would be in your answers, in your intellect, in your study. And we are called to live by faith. And there comes a point at which, if you are wrestling with whether or not to follow Christ, you need to say, I am going to give up questioning and trying to find every answer to every question, and I'm just going to commit my life. And I'm going to follow Him because I believe He is trustworthy, even if I don't know all the answers. And if you do know Christ, we still are in that same situation very often. We don't have all the answers. We can't resolve every situation we are in. But God calls us to trust Him. To trust Him and know that an eternity is ahead so we can live and walk with Him by faith now. So I want you to ask yourselves this morning what I've been asking myself as I've studied this week, and I haven't come up with all the answers, but what does it look like for you in your life, in your circumstance, to live by faith? What does that look like? What does it look like for us collectively, Berean Baptist Church, to live by faith, to follow God by faith? A year or so ago, we made a decision of faith, didn't we? We decided that we would search for and call an assistant pastor of CE and outreach. And by God's grace, He provided us with a great one. Pastor Jim and Karen are doing a great job. But we didn't have all the money, and we didn't have all the money in the budget at that point. And so there was an act of faith on our part. Now, faith doesn't mean, okay, well, God's got to take care of it. We still need you to give. And if you look at the budget, we're doing okay, but we could be doing better. So you can give some more as an act of faith on your part. But God called us as a church to step out by faith. And I believe He's going to continue to do that over the next months and years. You say, oh no, what's He going to propose? I have no proposal in mind. I just know God's not going to let us get comfortable and sit here. At least He doesn't want us to get comfortable and sit here. And so He's going to call us individually and collectively to step out by faith and to walk by faith. If our focus is just on this life, if our focus is on having all the answers, if our focus is on gaining all the material things we can, we will never walk by faith, because faith is risky. Faith follows even when we don't know where we are going, because we know God is leading there. There's a second characteristic in Abraham's life that is also really important for us to grasp and to ask ourselves, is this part of my life? If God were to clearly direct me to do something and I didn't know where I was going, would I do it? And if God were to clearly direct me and I didn't see how he would keep his promises to me, would I do it? Because faith is following even when we don't see how God's promises will be kept. That's really part of the story of all of Abraham's life. Following when he didn't see how God was going to do it. But there's a specific example that's given. That living by faith means that when God promises, we follow even if it seems like mission impossible. Because very simply put, faith believes what God promises. God says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Faith says, okay. Boy, it doesn't feel like God is here right now, but he has said he'll never leave me or forsake me. So he keeps his promises, even if I don't feel it today. He has promised that he would provide everything we need for life and godliness. And we have that opportunity to share the gospel, and the words kind of choke in our throat, and we're afraid we're going to mess up and do it wrong. And then we remember God's going to give me the words to say. He's going to give me what I need. And so by faith I can do this. Faith says, these are the things God has said he will do. I will live my life based on them, whether I see them all fulfilled as I would choose to or not. So Abraham and Sarah arrive in the land, and God promises them seed. He promises them descendants to fill that land that they don't have yet. And after 24 years pass, they still don't have a child. Now, you know the story, some of you, in Genesis. Maybe some of you don't. But you know that they don't always trust God in the midst of all of that. And I am really thankful that God doesn't say, oh, didn't trust me, I'm done with you now. And that here in Hebrews 11, God doesn't even mention how they didn't trust him. Instead, he focuses in on the fact that they really did follow. That was the trajectory of their life, even when they didn't see how God was going to keep the promise. So 24 years pass, and we read these words in verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past age. She was 90 at this point. She considered him faithful who had promised. How could she believe the impossible at 90? How could she believe, even though the first time she heard it from God, next year she laughed? How did she believe? By faith. Now it's interesting that you may have a translation of the Bible that sticks Abraham into this verse. Part of that is because we know the story in Genesis where she laughed when God said next year. Part of it is because that phrase, received power to conceive, is typically used of men in the New Testament in Greek language. And it may be that both of them are in view here, but the author of Hebrews pretty clearly puts Sarah into the picture and says, by faith, Abraham with Sarah, or by faith, Sarah received the strength, the power to conceive. When she was 90 and Abraham's 100, they have a child. Wow. They looked and they said, how in the world will God keep this promise? But we believe God will, and so we will obey. And that's where you and I are when we get that diagnosis from the doctor and we don't want to hear it, but we say, you know what, God's faithful. And I'm going to walk this path, and I'm going to believe God will keep his promise to be with me, whatever that may mean. That He'll give me the words to say as I seek to share the gospel. I believe that. So how in the world can we believe when we don't see how? How did Sarah believe when she didn't see how? Because faith sees beyond the obstacles to God. That you and I, we tend to see the obstacles because they're usually right here. Like the 10 spies of the 12. You know, they went into the land of promise and they came back with a report about all the giants. They came back with a report about all the obstacles. But 2, Joshua and Caleb, came back with a report about God. They said, God will give us the land. And Abraham and Sarah looked at themselves and they said, who ever heard of a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having children? Okay, but God said so. So we will believe even though the obstacles seem insurmountable to us. And I don't know what the obstacles are in your life. I don't know what the path is that God has laid out for you. But you may be thinking about a specific situation right now where those obstacles look enormous. Would you look beyond the obstacle and look up and see the faithful one? That's what it says. She considered him faithful who had promised. That's why she believed. I love the story of a map that, at least at one point in time, was in the British Museum in London. The map was drawn in 1525, and it roughly outlines the coast of the New World where you and I now live. And there were notations made by the map maker along that coast. Here be fiery scorpions. Here be dragons. Here be giants. In the 1800s, Sir John Franklin, the explorer and also a devout believer, came into possession of that map, and he crossed off all those annotations, and he wrote across it, "Here is God." So you look at the map of your life and you think, here be giants. Here be scorpions. Here be all these obstacles. And what we need to do is cross them off and say, here is God. Because God is going to walk with you through whatever that circumstance is. And it may not, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, end up the way you and I think it ought to. But it will end up in the way that is best for us and for the glory of God. And so Hebrews 11:12 tells us, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead. Wouldn't you love that, this description of you? Abraham lived for a lot of years after this, but God says at 100 he was as good as dead, not physically, but in terms of having children. As good as dead. We're born as descendants as many as the stars of the heaven. Every time we build a more powerful telescope, we discover there are more stars out there. Nobody can number them. And as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Ever try to count grains of sand on the shore of Lake Michigan? Multiply that times every beach in the world. What the author of Hebrews is saying is they believed God and God kept his promise. Though they couldn't see how, as a result of their faith, God kept his promise. Faith is following even when we don't see how God's promises will be kept. And the planners among us, that's me, and that's some of you, we want to know, yeah, but what if? Because we like to have the contingencies nailed down. But what if I don't have enough money at the end of the month? But what if the treatment for this disease doesn't work? But what if God calls me to school and I get to school and I am not up to the academics, or I can't pay the bill? Or what if God puts me into some new position of ministry at Berean and I'm going to try it and I bomb? What if? What if my spouse dies? What if? What if? What if? And instead of focusing on the what ifs, we need to focus on the one who is faithful. Now, that does not mean we don't plan. It doesn't mean we don't save. It doesn't mean we don't buy insurance. But that's not where our faith and hope are grounded. Our faith and hope are grounded in the one who is always faithful to his people. And we need to look to God. And we need to walk by faith. Because faith means following God, even when we don't see where and we don't see how. We follow because we know who. We know what God has said and what God has promised. And so ultimately you could really say this is what faith is. Faith is following God unconditionally. Faith is not saying, okay, God, I will follow you if you do this. Faith is not saying, God, I will follow you if when I pray you answer, if when I name it and claim it you give it to me. That's not faith. Faith is saying, God, I will follow you. Period. Because I know you. And if you don't know Christ, give up trying to get all the answers and say, God, I'll follow. I'll believe. I'll accept what Jesus Christ did for me on the cross and follow him. For those of us who are believers, our struggle is that we want to live by what we can see and feel and touch and know with certainty. And we don't always get to do that. You and I are blessed in this land that a lot of times we don't think we need faith. In fact, it was interesting. I was working, and this week I got an email from a missionary friend. You don't know him, but he was talking about faith and talking about how hard it is for those of us who live in the relatively affluent West to live by faith. Here's what he says. Not enough bread in the pantry? Go to the store. Sick? Take a pill. Short of money? Use your credit card. Troubled by a problem? Work harder. Now, there's nothing wrong with those things, but the reality is that a lot of times those things make it hard for us to walk by faith because we haven't trained ourselves to do it. So that begins in the little things. Training ourselves to trust God, to obey God, to do what God asks of us from day to day to day. Spending time in his word and in prayer and learning about him so that when the challenges do come, we know him even if we don't know where and we don't know how. And we're willing to follow and walk with God by faith. Because God is always trustworthy. Let's pray. Father, you are trustworthy. We are just beginning to look at the people on these pages in Hebrews 11. But they are men and women who, if they could speak to us today, would say to us, trust God because he will never fail you. And in fact, Father, they do speak to us today through your word. They are examples. They are a cloud of witnesses that stand around us, urging us on in our walk of faith. And Lord, I don't know what my brothers and sisters are facing. Many of them are carrying burdens they haven't shared with a lot of people. And I don't know what exactly it looks like for them to trust you in the middle of it, but I pray that they will. That they will believe in spite of the obstacles and the unknown. And they'll follow. And Lord, if there is anyone here or in connections or watching that has never trusted Christ, help them to give up the desire to have all the answers and place their simple faith and trust in what Christ did for them on the cross. It's in his name we pray. Amen. We're going to close with a song that says we are willing to follow unconditionally, that we will follow step by step. Make this your song and prayer of commitment to the Lord. And if there is something that you need help with spiritually, if you don't know Christ and want to accept him, I'll be here at the front as we sing. You just step out and come. Would you stand with me as we sing, please?